How China declared war on sparrows and triggered one of the most terrifying catastrophes of the 20th century. Good evening. Tonight's story sounds almost like a parable, almost too strange to believe at first. A small bird suddenly becomes the enemy of an enormous country. Millions of people pour into the streets banging pots, basins, drums, and sticks. And a decision that at first seemed perfectly reasonable turns, within a couple of years, into a tragedy with millions of victims. Let's travel back to China at the end of the 1950s. At the time, the country was living through a vast, highly ambitious experiment. After wars and upheavals, the new leadership wanted one thing above all: to rapidly transform agrarian China into a powerful industrial state. The idea was simple, almost hypnotic. If the whole nation united and worked to the point of exhaustion, an economic miracle could be pulled off in just a few years. In 1958, the Great Leap Forward began. The name was upbeat, full of promise. People were told of a new life, bountiful harvests, and rapid development. Peasants were merged into enormous communes. Fields were farmed according to new schemes. Small backyard furnaces for smelting metal sprang up everywhere. The entire country seemed to slip into a state of feverish enthusiasm. Against this backdrop, the authorities launched yet another campaign, a very unusual one. It was called the Four Pests Campaign. On the list were rats, flies, mosquitoes, and sparrows. The first three make sense. Stores. Flies spread disease. Mosquitoes, also an understandable case. But sparrows? Why did they end up on this list at all? The answer seemed logical enough. It was calculated that sparrows peck at grain and seeds. One bird eats only a little. But with millions of birds, the losses start to look serious. Simple arithmetic followed from there. Remove the sparrows, get more grain. More grain, better nutrition. Better nutrition, a richer country. On paper, it all looked beautiful. The problem was something else entirely. Nature doesn't take kindly to being reduced to a column of numbers. In the spring of 1958, the campaign swept across the whole country. People were given a concrete task: exterminate the sparrows. Everyone joined in: schoolchildren, workers, peasants, officials, even soldiers. Posters went up, meetings were held, newspapers printed calls to action. For many, it became almost a patriotic competition. The method of the hunt itself was especially wild. Someone had noticed that a sparrow cannot fly forever. Sooner or later, it needs to land and rest. So the solution was simple: just don't let it land. And so it began. Thousands of people took to the streets and kept up a continuous racket. They banged pots, they struck basins, they clanged pieces of metal, they shouted, they waved sticks. The birds took off in a panic, tried to find a place to rest, but everywhere they turned, a new wave of noise met them. They took to the air again, and again, and again. After a few hours, the sparrows' strength gave out. They dropped to the ground from sheer exhaustion. Witnesses to those events recalled that the streets of some cities were literally littered with dead birds. At the time, this was considered a victory. Photographs show entire heaps of slaughtered sparrows. Districts competed with one another over the number of birds destroyed. The authorities reported figures in the millions. It seemed the plan was working. But at that very moment, nature had already begun to answer back. Quietly, without any noise, as it usually does. The next agricultural season came, and something no one had expected began happening in the fields. The number of insects rose sharply. Caterpillars, locusts, and other pests all began multiplying far faster than before, because sparrows didn't eat only grain. Yes, they pecked at grain, but a huge part of their diet was actually insects, especially while they were feeding their chicks. Over the course of a season, a single sparrow family destroyed a mass of caterpillars and other vermin that devour crops. Once the birds were gone, the insects effectively lost their natural predators. The balance broke down. Real swarms of pests appeared in the fields. They devoured leaves, destroyed young shoots, ruined crops. In some places, locust invasions began. And here a bitter irony emerged. The insects caused far greater damage to the harvest than the sparrows ever could have. But the trouble didn't end there. At the same time, the country was running a whole series of risky agricultural experiments. Some of the new methods didn't work. In some places, they failed outright. Local officials inflated their figures. On paper, the numbers looked beautiful and kept climbing, while reality grew ever grimmer. At first, almost no one noticed. Then it became too late not to notice. By the end of the 1950s, harvests were falling and food reserves were shrinking. In the villages, people began noticing strange things. The fields looked worse. The leaves were eaten away. Young shoots were vanishing before their eyes. And there was one more detail: silence. Where the ordinary chirping of birds used to be, now there was nothing. But at the time, few people saw the connection to the campaign against the sparrows. On the contrary, those at the top kept believing the course they had chosen was correct. And it was here that another, deeply frightening story began, a story of lies in the official reports. Local officials were afraid to report bad news. If the harvest was poor, the paperwork still showed good figures. Then, at each successive level of administration, a little more optimism was added. In the end, the figures reaching the capital spoke of record grain harvests. On paper, abundance. In reality, something else entirely. To put it simply, one person says he harvested 100 sacks of grain. The next writes down 120, then 150. And before long, the people at the top are working with numbers that never exist. Yet it was precisely these numbers that decisions were based on. The state kept confiscating grain based on these falsified figures. As a result, in some rural areas, people were left with almost nothing. At first, it looked like just a hard season. Then it became clear: famine had begun. Food reserves in the villages dwindled away. People stretched their last remaining grain as far as they could. Portions shrank. Food grew ever poorer. Wild grasses, roots, tree leaves, and bark were all put to use. In the recollections of eyewitnesses, one and the same feeling comes up again and again: constant, grinding hunger. Not simply feeling like eating, but a state in which a person thinks of nothing but food from morning until night, when every single crumb matters, when the body slowly begins consuming itself. Gradually, the authorities came to understand that something very bad was happening. Reports of crop failures came in from the provinces. Scientists began speaking about the consequences of exterminating the sparrows. It turned out that what, in hindsight, should have been obvious all along was true. Sparrows were not only consumers of grain, but also an important part of the ecosystem. They kept insect populations in check, and in doing so, protected the harvest. The mistake had become impossible to ignore. In the early 1960s, the campaign against sparrows was effectively wound down. Moreover, sparrows were later even brought back in from neighboring countries in an attempt to restore some kind of balance. But calling off the campaign could no longer quickly undo the consequences, because by that point, the catastrophe had already unfolded in full force. A combination of ecological collapse, failed reforms, administrative self-deception, and grain requisition led to the Great Chinese Famine. According to various estimates, between 15 and 45 million people died. The numbers are staggering. And yes, it would be wrong to reduce this entire horror to the war on sparrows alone. The famine had more than one cause. There were many. But the story of the sparrows became, perhaps, the clearest possible symbol of what happens when power crudely intervenes in a complex system while barely understanding how that system works. Sometimes it seems, what's the big deal? It's just a little bird, a trifle. And then one species disappears, and following it, things that yesterday seemed rock solid begin to collapse. The harvest, the food, lives. That's the story. Almost absurd, and all the more frightening for it.